We have Doug Glanville on the line. Doug, how you doing?
All right. How are you?
We're doing well. We're struggling with some things, and the first person that I thought of and Jason thought of when this started to happen was you. We've talked to you about some of these issues before. You've been an important voice on so many issues, including the intersection of sports and society. You've taught a class at your alma mater at University of Pennsylvania, and now at UConn, where the class is aptly called Sports and Society. Before we talk about the role of sports and where we go from here, can you tell us how you felt the past couple weeks?
Well, I'll tell you, every kind of emotion. And, it's been a long week for everyone. And of course, when you compound it by living through a pandemic and just having that limited social contact, it's intense. And as, I have 4 kids and my wife. And so, we've had to dissect it from not only our perspective, from many others as we figure out what's appropriate to talk to the kids about at all. And they're pretty young. So, so that brought it home in that perspective. And then I just, watched how our country reacted and sort of the, relationship with law enforcement and generally communities of color is still so strained. And this is just sort of the summation of all that frustration is something that's on the more minor scale of issues turns into a death sentence. And, I've looked through it through a lot of lenses because I come at it, as you mentioned, through the teaching in a class at UConn. I come at it from being a professional athlete and, sitting down at one point this week with other players from my contemporaries who are African American, who are also retired and seeing that they don't feel comfortable. They still live with this intense insecurity because of race. But however, I have this experience with law enforcement on multiple levels that's been positive growing up. My father was a psychiatrist, and he used to counsel police officers. And when I watched that as a young person, I started to understand the stress they were under at an early age. Then my volunteer coaches were law enforcement. They were my summer league coaches and managers, and they looked out for us. So slowly, because I had this kind of access, I ended up being able to see them in this very family-oriented environment. I said, okay, well, this is my teammate. And it started to help me see sport as an opportunity, a way in to break down some of these barriers. So when I played at the major league level, by then those teammates from that summer league team, many of them became officers in my hometown, and they became close to my family. And when I played, they ended up becoming guardians and looking out for my parents when I was on the road. And when my father passed away, they came to the funeral in full uniform and gave a police escort to the interment and burial. So, when you come at it from those many perspectives, there's an aspect that gives me hope. I'm doing policy work in Connecticut on the police council, but there's so much pain, and we have to really unearth a lot of our history, bring it slowly to the present, and understand that this is stacked upon a legacy of problems that we've had with a relationship between law enforcement and communities of color in particular. And so if we don't address that, we can't just build neutral policy over it. We have to really backtrack and look at this objectively through very stringent lenses. So plenty of work to do, but at the same time, we have to do it together.
It seems like before we can build policy, we have to have conversation. And oftentimes it just seems like people are so uncomfortable with having that conversation that they retreat to their corner of where they're coming from and make the argument about them. And it seems like this week, the importance of listening is that much greater and understanding where other people are coming from. As a professor, how do you, approach your students now so that they can have these conversations with people who often just don't feel comfortable and want to take it in their own direction?
Well, it's difficult because it is uncomfortable. It is. And some of it comes to, we say at ESPN at times, you have to be comfortable being uncomfortable, right? It takes a lot of time, but the classroom is a great environment to kind of get the reps and practice of, all right, we're going to debate this or we're going to discuss this and sort of create alignment. But there's no question the exposure, just like I mentioned as being on a baseball team with a family of law enforcement, the exposure is critical because it does melt away a lot of the preconceived notions or the biases. A challenge in our country is we have such a deep segregation. I mean, I know we're past, the 60s, but we have still a tremendous amount of segregation. We have very much lack of access, or if you do have access, it's on certain terms. And certainly when you have a level of power, then those terms will be catered to your power. And so in the classroom, that's one element. But educating each other through our stories and really being empathetic and listening, it takes practice. It does. It takes a tremendous amount of time and practice, but that practice pays off because you will reach understanding. We're also battling an environment that is the ideological landscape around our politics is very difficult because now we're sliced in another way, saying, well, no, if you're this, you believe in that. If you're that, it's very binary. And our country was built on some level of middle ground. Thomas Jefferson in the two-party system, and we found ways to say, all right, we compromise because the process by which we reach compromise is equally as valuable as the end game as the result. We learn that the process is important because it makes you listen to other sides. It helps you engage. And there's something empowering when you don't get everything you want. You learn how to find that middle ground. Those exchanges are challenging in a social media landscape where 140 characters or 200 characters and who's fastest and quickest and gets the most likes and sort of the metrics of value is skewed away from deeper, richer content that actually is the slow work and takes a lot of depth and time to reach. And so we have to unpack a lot of things to get to the point where you're talking about. But it can be done. And I've certainly been through 3 courses now. And at the end, it's a very different experience from when we started.
Doug, one of the things that you just mentioned was about segregation. One of the places that is not as segregated is the locker room. But this week we've seen the locker room divides in player comments, especially over the last couple of days, most prominently with Drew Brees and also with Jake Fromm. If you were on the Saints and had a leadership role, what would you say to the interested parties? How would you deal with it?
Well, the first thing I would do is this. I mean, I noticed that Sam Horn, a former teammate of Brees, also spoke. And the thing that I found compelling about what he said is, I know Drew Brees. I know he's, a good person. I know he's looked out for the Black community. He gave examples, and then he kind of closed it by saying, if I know him as well as I think I know him, I'm paraphrasing, he will apologize and he will think and realize some of the pain he's caused. So part of it goes back to that previous point, is that the speed of information makes it difficult to really get the whole picture. For example, when I saw Drew Brees, I saw the quote, I went right to the video and I watched the whole thing. I watched everything I could because I wanted context. I mean, you can't take, a sentence and say that's what it all meant. So I watched it as much as I could. Then I went and sort of noticed that if I responded vehemently off the quote or part of it, if I started off that quote, then what would I have said the next day after he apologized? I mean, so when you rush to the bottom line and you don't have the humility to either apologize or rethink something or consider new information, then we're really not going to solve anything. And that's part of the problem. It's the doubling down of judging something before we get to the end game. Now, yes, I would have been very upset, even within the context of what he said, given the tenor of our country and where we are, and after George Floyd and all these things. Absolutely. However, the conversation would still be an opportunity to talk to a teammate, because as teammates, you think about a baseball season. Every year we go to spring training. People come from all over the world, all over the country. They settle in. We don't know some of these players. We have preconceived notions of where they're from. And then all of a sudden, you have a baseball experience. You come together, you have a goal, you're a team, and then you see it in evidence. You watch who hustles every play. You watch who works out in the locker room. You watch who you want to give the ball to in the ninth inning. And you find these examples that transcend a lot of these simplistic ways to judge somebody. And you start to look at content and character and something deeper. Yeah, we still come from somewhere, but we have a goal. And the more time you put in, that game 162 at the end of the season, you have a very different perception of who that person is. And that type of intimacy, or at least close proximity with conversation, matters. And so Drew Brees and others, there's going to be challenges at times when you're playing with someone that disagrees. You have experiences and how you grew up, but you don't forget the objective. And And right now, the team we're talking about is the United States of America, and you have to get on that page to be able to move forward.
You talk about the rush to reaction in the social media, era. Are you encouraged or discouraged overall by the discourse we're seeing, in that you have people of all races participating in protests and conversations? You have athletes utilizing the platforms that they have seemingly at a greater number than they have previously. It seems like you have some sort of dialogue with some of these leagues, though there is criticism of the hypocrisy of them speaking out at this point. Are you encouraged or discouraged by what you're seeing in the reaction separate from the actual actions out in the streets?
I'm encouraged. I mean, the players and these athletes have a certain platform, and it's challenging. It's a huge responsibility, and it's certainly tough when you're a current player because of the backlash, and it's going to come. But at the same time, they are in a position to embody the example that I just laid out. They live in an environment that works on teamwork across many different lines. They work in an environment where the rules are tantamount to how the game survives. You have to have rules to come up with a balance, and it's equitable. My rules, if I'm playing basketball, it's not like the size of the hoop on one end is different than the size on the hoop on my end. And we accept that as athletes because we want fairness. We don't feel it's a victory if I shot on the basketball hoop the size of the Atlantic Ocean and you're shooting against a postage stamp. It has valor and value to have some sort of equitable landscape. And of course, it doesn't always achieve it. There's ways that people cut corners and steroids and all these different things, but it's aspirational. And those athletes live and breathe that, and every single day of their lives, they are athletes in that mind, body, and soul. So they're very qualified to speak. I categorically reject shut up and dribble. I categorically reject it because you have this opportunity, landscape, influence. And sure, we may not still agree with what comes out of someone's mouth about what they're saying, but the engagement is important. And they've figured out a way to navigate the diversity of a locker room for a common goal. Those are great examples of what we should look to. So I welcome the conversation. Drew Brees, it doesn't matter. It's like you need to have these conversations because it sets the table, even in the sporting environment, to have a larger conversation as we're talking about race in America. You're able to get the tool set and the skills to talk to different people and recognize that you're aligned in a lot more ways than you're divided. I mean, nobody's binary. You can't say, I'm a Democrat and let me check off 15 different things and we all agree on every single one of them, or I'm a Republican and it's ridiculous. It becomes ideological. And there's too much middle ground, and athletes exemplify that exact example.
You mentioned athletes exemplifying the example and encouraging the conversation. The other day you did a Zoom with a lot of former players. Ryan Howard and Jimmy Rollins in particular were on there. It was eye-opening to hear some of their stories. Can you talk a little bit about that conversation for our listeners that maybe missed it?
Yeah, well, Ken Rosenthal texted me on Saturday and said, hey, I'm thinking about having a roundtable panel on Zoom. I'm having a lot of trouble getting the current players, but I want to talk to African-American players about their experience in this country. And I was signed up, and it ended up a panel with Jimmy Rollins and Ryan Howard, LaTroy Hawkins, Torrey Hunter, Dontrell Willis, and I got to use my professor skills and moderate it. And I mean, it was powerful because for me personally, I found an alliance. You realize you kind of go your separate ways, your career ends. And then I realized, okay, I'm similarly situated. They have these same experiences. You may have known that from a distance, but to really talk through it. And there was a lot of pain. Not just because of George Floyd, because how they have to exist and navigate living in this country. And they're patriots. They're grateful. They believe in it, but they still know that there's a second-class citizenship component to race in America. And you think about the examples. LaTroy Hawkins, every time he went to a city, he'd go right to the police department to introduce himself to make sure that they knew he was there and knew his family. You see Torrey Hunter almost apologetically saying, we're not all bad. I have to approach it this way. Jimmy Rollins had a practical, pragmatic approach to it, questioning, okay, if I'm in uniform versus I'm out of uniform, how am I treated? Dontrell Willis talking about, hey, I don't know what I tell my kids. I'm not sure when to actually introduce this conversation. I mean, it was a fascinating landscape. And I think the key I took away was there's so many within the unification of the common experience of being a man of color in America. You also have these diverse vantage points by how they strategically approach it. They have very different views on how they attack it. And there's a solitude to that because it wasn't necessarily aligned. We didn't necessarily bounce it off each other until we have these concentrated moments like George Floyd. So bringing it together, you hear these stories, and there's a common story through it, and you see the thin line that's between something mundane that you're doing and a death sentence. You see the thin line of doing something and someone calling 911 because you're jogging in the neighborhood. I could tell you 3 major stories I had in the last 5 years of just, being in these highly compromised situations. And so it's important to hear that pain, and also the fact that they're sharing them, the empathy that can sort of come from that. But these are, multi-million-dollar star, MVP, all-star, and what it tugs at is this idea that if you do things a certain way, if you follow the rules, if you achieve greatness or you have so much money you can buy your way around it, that doesn't apply to these African-American gentlemen. And in some ways, the positive in that is there's a humility to it, and there's a connection to a group of people regardless of class and status that we say we're one. And in other ways, when that one is lumped into a way that you're profiled and criminalized around it, that is a great pain that comes with it. But they shared it very openly, and I found it to be a very transformational experience for me.
Doug, one of the reasons that I know we admire you and so many people admire you is not only because you speak about these issues, but because you put them into action. You talked to us, I think last time we were on, about what you did when you were out in L.A. And now I know you mentioned at the beginning of this that you're working with your local community. Can you tell us what you're doing and what we all can do in our own local communities to make this better?
Well, I appreciate that. I've taken time because when I go back to that example of engaging law enforcement, I was in a town of Teaneck, New Jersey that voluntarily desegregated in the 60s. So I watched as I grew up this commitment to an inclusive society. And it was not easy, but they said, this is what we're doing. And it takes a lot of courage. It takes a lot of cutting down certain walls. It takes time. But it's amazing that I watched the generational shift, even as I got older, about how people became so comfortable with this access to people of all walks of life. So that may not be possible in every community. In fact, it's probably unlikely in most communities in our country. However, there is a chance to say something. There's a chance to move in and take steps to engage on that ground level. Because if you look at George Floyd, for example, everybody can have a voice and go to their local police department and ask questions, say, hey, what's your policy on this? What's the state say on this? I'm on a council called the Police Officer Standards and Training Council that sets policy around training and standards, and pretty incredible. And there's civilians like myself on this council. That should be a standard all through the country. So it's possible to make a difference, and it may only have to start with on a small level. But I think the nature of overlooking things. You have all these people that really do care about this. They're in pain about George Floyd. Doesn't matter their background, but it's the silence that is so powerful and in some ways that can be so poisonous, because it's okay. Well, I'm in a good spot, so I'm not going to say anything. I'm afraid to say something. I'm afraid to do anything. Engage the process, and I have so many examples. We were able to pass a law from one of the experiences I had with a police officer in my driveway when I was snow shoveling, and it was a lot of work, but it was the process in and of itself was so powerful, because as we went along closer to getting this law passed, everybody sort of started jumping on board and investing in it, and then the work is not that tough because everybody starts to protect something that they care about. So, engaging that process is absolutely important, and recognize that some people don't feel the power nor the access to do that. And so fixing the process to create that engagement is also part of it.
Well, Doug, we want to thank you for taking the time to talk to our audience and talk to us about this. And we hope everybody will continue to have these conversations. If we don't want to enroll at the University of Connecticut, where can everybody see you and listen to you and read your pieces?
Don't get me wrong. I'd like to enroll at the University of Connecticut. It's just a far trip for class.
No, well, I always think of like, how can I do this, larger online or something. So I've been brainstorming. Well, I'm very active on Twitter. We're just posting a essay I wrote called Enough for ESPN, and very excited about it. It's something that was personal, but I had a great team to work with. So I love Twitter. So it's just simply at Doug Glanville. It's my first name and last name tied together. And I'm on the usual places. Facebook, not as much, but Instagram. But I love Twitter. And, and I'm very accessible. If you email me, I get right back to you. So reach out anytime. And I do, my podcast with Jason Stark has been such a joy. It's called Starkville. So you'll see me out The Athletic from time to time. So absolutely reach out. Any more information on this, I'm glad to share it.
That is a lot of fun to listen to with Starkville and to follow you on Twitter. And we will absolutely reach out again because we enjoy having this conversation with you to try and move things forward a little bit. So thanks for everything you're doing, Doug.
Yeah, I appreciate it. And I got to say, you guys have a fantastic, important show. So thanks for reaching out to me.
Thank you so much. Doug, you take care of yourself and we'll talk soon.
Okay, take care.